When his eyes met mine across that courtroom, the gavel slipped from his hand. That sound, that sharp wooden clatter, echoed louder than any verdict I'd ever heard. Abreu, every head turned. The courtroom went silent, except for that hollow thud rolling across the marble floor. And the judge, the Honorable Judge Matthew Grayson, the man who prided himself on composure, discipline, and authority, just stood there, staring at me as if he'd seen a ghost. He knew who I was. But no one else did. I hadn't planned some tolls. I only came there to testify, to speak the truth that had haunted me for years. But when he saw me, his whole world cracked open, and mine, after years of silence, finally began to heal. Before that day, my life was quiet. Too quiet, maybe. I lived in a small yellow house on the edge of Brookville, the kind of town where everyone knows who you are, but no one really knows you. I spent my mornings tending to my little garden, talking to my plants like they were old friends. Lavender, rosemary, mint. They all listened better than most people ever did. Broa. I worked part-time at the local library. The place always smelled like paper and lemon polish. Children came in after school, giggling and running through aisles their parents thought were too sacred to touch. I used to smile at them and say, "Be loud, just a little. Life's too short to whisper all the time." I was good at pretending my life was peaceful. But peace isn't the same as quiet. Quiet is just the absence of noise. Peace is the absence of pain. Hebrew and I hadn't known peace for nearly 15 years. It all started with a love story. At least, that's what I thought it was. I met Daniel when I was 24. He was confident, charming, and spoke with that slow, deliberate tone that made you believe every word mattered. He worked in the county's legal office, sharp suit, quick wit, and a laugh that could disarm anyone. He was the kind of man who seemed to belong to everyone, the kind you felt lucky to call your own. We married after a year of dating. I wore my mother's lace dress. He cried at the altar, real tears, the kind that fall when a man is proud to love you. I still remember how his hands trembled when he slipped the ring on my finger. "You'll never have to doubt me," he said. And I believed him. "You bought a house, that same yellow one I still live in." He said he wanted to fill it with laughter and children, but laughter faded quickly in that house. And the children, well, they never came. Daniel started coming home late. Wait. At first, it was work. Always work. Court ran long, he'd say, tossing his jacket onto the couch. Then it became drinks with the guys. And then silence. No explanations at all. I remember one night, the smell of rain coming through the open window, the sound of his car pulling up. It was nearly midnight. He walked in, his tie loose, eyes bloodshot. I asked him softly, "Everything okay?" He just said, "Don't start, Lydia." That was the first time he called me by my name without warmth. Just a flat, heavy tone. I didn't ask again. You see, when you love someone deeply, you convince yourself that patience is love. You wait for things to get better. You tell yourself he's tired, stressed, distracted, anything but cruel. Then waited for years. Then one day, a letter came in the mail. It was addressed to him, but the handwriting caught my eye. Neat, careful loops. I shouldn't have opened it. But something in me, some quiet, desperate instinct, told me I had to. It wasn't a love letter. Exactly. It was a thank you note from a woman named Grace. She thanked him for believing in her case and for protecting her when no one else would. At the bottom, there was one line that made my hands tremble. I don't know what I would have done without you that night. You saved me, in more ways than one. I felt the blood drain from my face. I didn't know who Grace was, but I knew what that tone meant. That was. The first clue, the first crack in the story I had been telling myself for so long. I didn't confront him right away. I watched him involved in something illegal, and his brother, the judge, was protecting him. For years, I'd thought Daniel's lies were only about love. I was wrong. They were about power. I didn't confront him that night. I couldn't. My hands were shaking too hard. Instead, I hid the papers in a box under the floorboard in my study, the same place I kept my wedding album. But my silence didn't last. Borough. 2 weeks later, the FBI came knocking. Borough, 2 agents, polite but firm, asked if I was Mrs. Lydia Grayson. They wanted to speak to my husband. Daniel was at work. I told them I'd let him know, but their eyes lingered on me a little too long, as if they already knew. When they left, I sat on the porch for hours. The sun sank, the cicadas began to hum, and I finally understood. Whatever Daniel had done, it was about to come crashing down. I had a choice, protect him or tell the truth. And for the first time in my life, I chose myself. That night, I packed a small suitcase and drove to my sister's house 2 towns over. Her name was Nora. Practical, kind, and endlessly patient. When I showed up at her door with swollen eyes, she didn't ask a single question. She just made tea, handed me a blanket, and let me breathe. It took 3 days before I could tell her everything. When I did, she listened quietly, then said something I'll never forget. You've spent years cleaning up his messes, Lydia. Maybe it's time you stop being his alibi. She was right. So, I made a decision that would change everything. I contacted the federal investigator assigned to Daniel's case. At first, they were cautious. I was still his wife, after all. But when I handed over the documents from his briefcase, their tone shifted. They thanked me. One of them said, "You just gave us what we've been missing." It was the first time in years I felt useful. The following months were a blur of interviews, statements, and endless questions. I told them everything I knew about Daniel, about Grace, about the nights he came home smelling of whiskey and fear. When the case finally reached trial, the courtroom was full. Everyone from Brookville came to watch the great Daniel Grayson face judgment. His brother, Judge Matthew, had recused himself from the case. Of course, still whispers followed him everywhere. But the irony, the poetic twist of it all, was that I was called as the key witness, and on the morning of that hearing, when I stepped into the courtroom, every eye turned toward me. I was no longer the quiet librarian, no longer the naive wife. I was the woman who held the truth in her hands. Then the door opened, and Judge Matthew Grayson, the presiding judge for that day's preliminary hearing, walked in. He looked up, ready to begin proceedings. But when his gaze landed on me, he froze. The gavel slipped from his hand, clattering against the floor. Because he knew exactly who I was. And he knew what I knew. I kept my eyes steady, my hands calm on the table. Inside, my heart was pounding so loud I thought everyone could hear it. For years, Matthew had believed I was just Daniel's silent wife. But he didn't know what I had seen, what I had kept hidden. The courtroom went still. He cleared his throat, trying to regain composure. "Proceed," he said softly. But his voice wavered. In that moment, I understood something. Truth doesn't need to shout to be powerful. Sometimes it just needs to stand quietly in the room and wait for everyone else to catch up. When the hearing began, I told my story. Slowly, clearly, truthfully. I saw Daniel's face twist in disbelief as I spoke. The same disbelief of a man who thought he'd never be held accountable. Grace sat in the back, her head lowered, avoiding my eyes. And Judge Matthew? He listened, silently, rigidly, like a man watching his world unravel, thread by thread. By the time I finished, the room was heavy with something unspoken. The truth hung there, sharp and undeniable. But I wasn't done yet, because I had one last truth to tell. The one no one expected. The last truth I revealed that day didn't come from anger. It came from years of silence. Years of being the woman who swallowed her pain to keep the peace. But peace built on lies never lasts. I took a slow breath, my voice steady as I looked at the courtroom and said, Your Honor, before this court proceeds, I'd like to add something for the record. Ebruch Judge Matthews' eyes met mine, and for the briefest second, I saw fear. Not the kind of fear that comes from guilt alone, but from recognition. I've stayed quiet about a lot, I continued, but I can't anymore, because silence is what brought us here. Diabro, the prosecutor, nodded for me to go on. The audience leaned forward. I explained that the financial misconduct case, the one Daniel was charged with, didn't start with him. It began years earlier with a property development fund tied to Matthew's chambers. Daniel had acted as the intermediary, transferring funds that didn't belong to either of them. When the discrepancies were discovered, they falsified records. Matthew's signature approving the transactions, Daniel's name on the accounts. A blur. They thought no one would ever find out, but I had seen those papers, and worse, I had the originals. A blur. The courtroom buzzed. Someone gasped. Daniel's lawyer objected, but it was too late. The truth was out. A blur. Judge Matthew tried to speak, but his voice faltered. Mrs. Grayson, these are serious accusations. I looked straight at him and said softly, You're right, Your Honor, they are, but serious doesn't mean false. The prosecutor stepped forward, asking if I could provide evidence. I'd evidence. I nodded. Ask in this box, I said, motioning to the worn wooden chest I'd brought, the same one that had sat under my floorboards all those years. Bruffy, the clerk, took it, opening it carefully. Inside were the documents Daniel had hidden. Original financial ledgers, copies of bank transfers, and one sealed letter addressed to Matthew. It was his handwriting. The letter was short, just a few sentences. The funds have been moved. I'll take the blame if it comes to that. Just make sure this doesn't reach Lydia. Bro. I had read those lines so many times that they were burned into my memory. When the letter was read aloud, the entire courtroom fell silent. Judge Matthew's face turned pale. His lips parted, but no words came. The bailiff stepped forward instinctively, unsure if this was contempt or confession. I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt free. After the hearing adjourned, chaos erupted. Reporters outside, whispers inside, and a storm of betrayal swirling in every corner of that courthouse. Daniel was escorted out, not handcuffed yet, but close. He wouldn't look at me. Grace tried to reach for him, but he brushed past her. I remember stepping outside, feeling the cold air hit my face. For the first time in years, I could breathe deeply. The wind carried the scent of rain and city dust, and it felt clean, painfully clean. But freedom, I soon learned, comes at a price. Ibrahim. A week later, Matthew resigned from his position as judge. The investigation expanded, both brothers under scrutiny. Their last name, once spoken with pride in Brookville, became a warning. Ibrahim and me? Ibrahim became the woman everyone wanted to interview. Neighbors stopped me at the grocery store asking questions disguised as sympathy. You must feel so betrayed, they'd say. We never thought he could do something like that. Bakin want pity. I didn't want revenge. I just wanted peace, the kind that comes when you stop lying to yourself. So I sold the yellow house, packed every piece of my old life into 3 boxes. The lavender in the garden was the hardest to leave. It had been my quiet companion through everything. I cut one small bundle and wrapped it in paper. My reminder that even in broken soil, something gentle can grow. For a while, I moved in with Nora. Her home was smaller but full of warmth, the kind that doesn't need proven. We'd sit by the fireplace, sipping tea, and she'd say, "You look lighter these days." Maybe I'd smile faintly. "Maybe that's what truth does," I'd answer. "It doesn't erase the pain, but it takes away the weight." But life has a strange way of circling back. 2 months after the trial, I received a letter in the mail, no return address. The handwriting was neat, deliberate. I opened it, half expecting anger. Ibri once from Judge Matcham. Lydia, aber, early, Lydia, Cabra. I've thought of that day in court every night since. You were right to speak. You were braver than both of us combined. I don't ask for forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that the truth you told saved more than just yourself. It saved me from living a lie any longer. Burke, Matthew. I stared at that letter for a long time. Not because I forgave him, but because I understood him. Power corrupts quietly. So does fear. I folded the letter and tucked it away beside the lavender sprig I'd kept. Months turned into a year. Daniel's trial concluded. Guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to 6 years. Grace left town before the verdict. Some said she moved to Chicago, others said she married again. I didn't care to know. As for me, I began rebuilding. I took a full-time job at a legal aid center, helping women who'd been silenced, just like I once was. Listening to their stories, I realized that betrayal has many faces, but so does survival. And every time I walked into that little office, smelling of coffee and old paper, I remembered the woman I used to be, afraid, quiet, compliant, and silently thanked her for finally breaking. Because if she hadn't, I wouldn't have been reborn. One evening, I attended a local community event, a fundraiser for victims of domestic and financial abuse. They asked me to speak. Kibur. I stood before that small crowd, my voice calm but firm. I used to think justice only lived in courtrooms, I said. But real justice starts when you tell the truth, even if your voice shakes. Sometimes it's not about punishing others, it's about reclaiming yourself. When I stepped down, a young woman approached me, tears in her eyes. You don't know me, she said, but your story, it gave me the courage to leave. Maberthwen, that single moment made every scar worth it. Later that night, sitting alone in my car, I looked at the courthouse in the distance. The lights were dim, the flags still. It struck me. That place where I'd once been broken had become the place where I found my strength. And as I drove away, I whispered softly to myself, Iburi. No one knew who I really was until that day. Now, neither do I. But maybe that's the beauty of starting over. Life after the trial moved slower, almost hesitantly, as if the world itself was learning to trust me again, the same way I was learning to trust it. I rented a small cottage near the edge of town, surrounded by oak trees and the sound of wind rustling through dry leaves. It was quiet there, but not the kind of quiet that suffocates. This quiet was gentle, like a deep exhale after years of holding my breath. Each morning I'd make coffee and sit by the window, watching the sun stretch its arms across the field. Some mornings I'd talk out loud, not to anyone in particular, but to the version of myself that had survived it all. I'd say, "You did it, Lydia. You made it through." Kibur said. And on the hard days when guilt crept in, guilt for exposing the man I once loved, guilt for breaking a family apart, I reminded myself, truth doesn't destroy what's real. It only burns away what's false. One evening, a knock came at the door. It was soft, almost uncertain. When I opened it, I froze. Standing there was a woman in a pale blue coat, her eyes tired but familiar. Grace, I said quietly. She looked thinner, older, like life had taught her lessons she never wanted to learn. She clutched a small envelope in her hands and envelope in her hands. May I come in? May I come in? I come in? She asked. I hesitated for a moment, then stepped aside. Of course. We sat across from each other in the living room. The silence between us was thick, filled with all the words that had gone unsaid. Finally, she spoke. I know I'm the last person you want to see, but I needed to apologize. I didn't say anything. I just listened. She told me her story. How she met Daniel through a community legal workshop, how he helped her with her late father's estate, how she fell in love with him slowly, not knowing he was married at first. Aber, by the time she found out, she said it was too late. Said, too late. He had this way of making you feel like you were saving him, she said softly, her eyes glassy. I thought I was special, but I see now I was just next in line. Ebru, she handed me the envelope. He wrote this before sentencing. I think you should read it. Still familiar, I opened it after she left. Kastibur, the letter was short. His handwriting. Still familiar, still strong. Lydia Abrahi, I don't expect forgiveness. I just want you to know that everything fell apart the moment you stopped believing in my lies. I used to think I controlled everything, but losing you showed me how small I really am. Hey Bree, don't waste your freedom on hating me. Live well. That'll be the only justice that matters. Ubr. I read it twice. Then I folded it, slid it into a drawer, and whispered to the empty room. I already am. Ebru months passed, and with each season, the past grew quieter. The ache never disappeared completely, but it softened, like an old scar that only stings when the weather changes. One afternoon, while organizing some files at the Legal Aid Center, I got a call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was formal, polite. Ram. Mrs. Grayson? Yes? Fadbrer. This is the clerk's office. We wanted to inform you that the estate of Judge Matthew Grayson has listed you as a secondary beneficiary. Fur. I blinked. I'm sorry, what? Brr, the clerk continued. He left a note along with the documents. Would you like it mailed or delivered? My heart sank. Delivered, I said quietly. When the courier arrived 2 days later, I sat at my desk staring at the sealed envelope. I hadn't heard from Matthew since that first letter, the one thanking me for my courage. Now, he was gone. Inside was a handwritten note and a small brass key. Opera. You once told the court that silence is what brought us here. You were right. I lived my life behind walls of duty and pride until the truth you spoke broke them down. There's a box in my study, the drawer by the window. The key is yours. Inside, you'll find what should have been said long ago. Matthew. Abraki curiosity tugged at me like a thread. I drove to his old house, a grand empty thing on a hill overlooking town. The gate creaked open as if it hadn't been touched in months. Eberly inside, the air smelled of old books and dust, the kind of silence that holds stories. Eberle in his study, sunlight filtered through the blinds, cutting stripes across the desk. I found the drawer, turned the brass key, and opened it. Ebro inside was a single leather-bound notebook on the first page. In neat, careful writing were the words Burski, confession. Ebru, I sat down and began to read. Matthew had written about everything. The fund, the cover-up, the pressure to protect his brother. But woven between the confessions were reflections about morality, about failure, about how power can twist love into obligation. One line struck me so deeply I had to stop reading. Uberer. We both loved him. You as his wife, me as his brother. And in our own ways we enabled him, you with forgiveness, me with silence. I felt tears slide down my cheeks. He wasn't wrong. We were both guilty of trying to protect someone who never learned how to protect anyone else. At the end of the notebook was a simple entry, Ibrashidri, the truth will outlive us all, but sometimes it needs a voice. Thank you for being that voice, Lydia. Ebruk. I closed the notebook, pressing my hand over the cover as if to absorb the weight of it. In that still, dusty room, I whispered, Rest now, Matthew. I think we've both done enough penance. When I left the house, the sun was setting. Same orange hue that once bathed my yellow home years ago. But this time, the light didn't feel painful. It felt forgiving. On my way back, I stopped by the courthouse. I parked across the street, just as I had the night I followed Daniel. The building looked different now, smaller, almost humble. I watched as people walked in and out, each of them carrying their own hidden stories, their own quiet truths waiting to be told. For a moment, I thought about how strange it is that life can take you from the witness stand to the other side of healing. I smiled to myself and said softly, "The judge froze. The judge froze when he saw me that day. But I think it was because he finally recognized the truth and the woman who refused to stay silent." Brewery. Then I turned the key in my ignition and drove home. The lavender field outside my cottage swayed in the evening breeze, and I knew, in every sense that mattered, that my story had finally come full circle. The seasons rolled on like pages turning in a well-worn book. I watched the world around me change, the trees shedding their gold, the air growing colder. Yet for the first time, the change didn't frighten me. There was something healing about watching nature move forward without apology. It reminded me that I could too. I started writing again, not letters, not statements, but stories, real stories, about women like me, women who'd been betrayed, silenced, or underestimated, but still found a way to stand again. I'd sit by my window every morning, coffee steaming beside me, pen in hand. My handwriting was slow, deliberate, almost meditative. Each word felt like a step toward reclaiming a voice I'd lost long ago. Sometimes I'd laugh to myself, thinking, maybe this is what freedom really looks like, messy, quiet, and deeply mine. A year after everything happened, I was invited to speak at a law school seminar, the same one where Daniel once taught part-time. The irony wasn't lost on me. They asked me to talk about the human side of justice. When I stepped up to the podium looking out at a sea of young faces, I took a moment before speaking. My story, I began, isn't about revenge or punishment. It's about truth and what it costs to tell it. I spoke about how justice isn't always clean or swift. Sometimes it's slow and painful, like pulling a thorn from a wound that never healed right. But it's necessary. When the session ended, one of the students, a young woman with trembling hands, came up to me. She said, "My mom went through something like you. She never told anyone. I think I'll ask her about it tonight." That moment, that small spark, reminded me that even pain, when shared honestly, can become light for someone else. Back at home, my days grew simpler. I'd tend to my lavender and mint, bake bread on Sundays, and sometimes walk to the lake just to watch the reflection of the sky. Alisht. A Brug. I sat on the stone ledge, watching the sun dip low. The courthouse clock chimed softly, 3 slow, deliberate tones, and I thought about that moment years ago when Matthew dropped his gavel after seeing me. That sound had once symbolized shock, guilt, unraveling. But now, in memory, it felt different. It felt like an ending and a beginning. Kibru. I started a small support group in town, just a few women at first. Some divorced, some widowed, some still finding the courage to speak. We called it Second Voices. Each week, we'd sit in a circle, share tea and tears, and talk about the things we thought no one wanted to hear. One woman, Marlene, said one night, "I didn't know people like us could start over." Brew. I smiled at her. "That's the secret no one tells you, Marlene. Starting over isn't about forgetting who you were. It's about choosing who you want to be next." They started calling me Aunt Lydia. It made me laugh. I guess that's what happens when you finally learn your lesson. Life gives you a new role to play, and in that room with all those women, I realized something profound. For so long, I'd been the story. Now, I was the storyteller. On the anniversary of the trial, I visited Daniel's grave. Not many people did. The cemetery was quiet, the air crisp, the sky overcast. I brought a small sprig of lavender, the same kind that had grown in our old garden. Laying it gently on his stone, I whispered, "We made a mess of it, didn't we?" Gust of wind, a gust of wind carried my words away. Hope you found peace, I added, because I finally have. Jebri. Then I stood there for a moment, just listening to the stillness. No anger, no bitterness, only closure. Ebrur, and when I turned to leave, I felt lighter than I had in years. That night, as I sat by the window of my cottage, I could see the moonlight dancing across the lavender field. The world outside was quiet, but my heart was full. Ebro. I thought about everything, the love, the lies, the courtroom, the truth. And I smiled, because every chapter, even the painful ones, had brought me here. Here, where silence had turned into strength, where guilt had become gray. Once trembled in the face of power, now stood firmly in her own truth. When people ask me now what happened, I tell them, once a judge froze in court when he saw me. But that wasn't the story. The story was that, for the first time in my life, I didn't freeze. Kibrher, because courage, I've learned, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply stands up, speaks the truth, and refuses to sit back down. You know, sometimes life doesn't give us the closure we think we deserve. Sometimes it gives us something quieter, something softer, a lesson whispered through the cracks of what once broke us. That courtroom, that judge, that marriage. Hebra, all of it feels like a lifetime ago now. Ibra, and maybe it was, because the woman who stood trembling in that witness box, she's gone. She left that place the moment she realized her voice carried more power than any gavel ever could. I still pass by that courthouse sometimes. Ibrahi, the steps are the same, the marble floors still echo, but I walk past it now without flinching. Ibrahi, there's peace in that. The kind you don't beg for or chase, the kind that comes when you finally understand that justice isn't always about punishment. Ibr, sometimes it's about truth finding its way home. Ibrahi and mine did. It found me. In the silence after the storm, in the pages of the stories I now write, in the faces of women who remind me that survival isn't shameful. It's sacred. If you had told me years ago that I'd be standing here, telling this story, not as a victim, but as a witness to my own rebirth, I would have laughed through my tears, but that's the beautiful, messy truth about life. Ebrory. It doesn't end when everything falls apart. Ebrory, it begins there. It begins when you finally say, this happened to me, but it does not define me. So, if you're listening tonight, maybe sitting in your car or curled up on your couch, with that heavy, quiet kind of ache, I want you to remember something. Hebrew, you are not powerless. Hebrew, you are not invisible. And your story, no matter how shattered it feels, still belongs to you. Hebrew, Kellet. Hebrew, own it, because one day looks at you, maybe with the same shock, the same recognition that once froze a judge in his tracks. They'll see not who you were, but who you became. Ibrahim, and that will be your verdict. Peace, justice, and freedom, written in your own voice.